prediction that the next Supreme Court justice could, in fact, be Brett Kavanaugh. What will that do for our nation and for our future? Well, we have an incredible panel here on this live program today on Real News, starting with our guest here from the ACLU. And Dana Vickers Shelley joins us, Executive Director of the ACLU of Maryland. Great to see you, Dana, and welcome to the Real News.
Thank you, Mark. Glad to be here.
Paul Jay is with us, who is the Executive Director and President of the CEO, whatever your title is here, the Real News.
None of those,
but you're there.
Something like that.
And also the founder,
senior editor.
Senior editor, and also the founder of Real News, along with Charmaine Perez, and Dharna Noor, who is producer here at the Real News, is with us as well.
Thanks, Mark.
So let's begin. I think that what we saw today, Dana, with Susan Collins speaking, one of the things that struck me, thinking about you and your organization, is that the ACLU very rarely takes a position about a nominee for the Supreme Court, or any strict position like this in the years it's been on the ground here in the United States. But this time you did. Talk a bit about that.
Correct. In the ACLU's 98-year history, this is only the fourth time that our national board has voted to oppose a Supreme Court nomination. This year and this time with this nomination, our board said that they found the allegations and the reporting of Dr. Ford to be credible, and were concerned that there was inadequate investigation and looking into those. And based on that, we are opposing the nomination of Judge Kavenaugh.
So just before we turn to Paul Jay here for a moment, I'm curious then, for you and the others at the ACLU, the events of the last several days, you were at the demonstration that took place yesterday at the Hart Senate building, right?
Yep.
You weren't arrested though, were you?
I was not arrested. Members of my staff were arrested. We were all there in the Hart Senate building after marching there from the courthouse to the Supreme Court building and then to the Hart Senate building, where we unfurled several banners, and we were both talking to our elected officials, those key senators, as well as letting the public, the wider audience and community of Americans know that we believe survivors, we believe that this process has been completely rushed and unacceptable, and that Judge Kavenaugh does not have the temperament to be a Supreme Court Justice of the United States, a permanent lifetime position.
So I'm going to come back to that because, I mean, there's a real leap here between the events of yesterday when thousands of people were occupying the Senate Hart building, and it was a fevered pitch opposing this nomination, and then we see Susan Collins in her speech today, which really was kind of night and day in terms of what we can expect. So I'm going to get to Paul, but I just want to do your reactions to that, since you were in the midst of all that yesterday.
Well, Senator Collins' comments today, her statement on the floor that I listened to this afternoon was very disappointing. If she heard the voices of Americans who were there, who were in the Senate building yesterday, who were at the Supreme Court speaking out, people from all across the country, from Maine, from Alaska, from West Virginia, from Nebraska, from Maryland, talking about why this is so important and why we need to have our senators vote no for this nomination, and that Senator Collins brought up Dr. Ford's testimony, her review of the FBI report, the abbreviated FBI report, and concluded, based on that, not thinking about the process, not addressing the process, which the leadership of the Senate endorsed and advocated for, which is where so much of this problem and this challenge with Judge Kavanaugh's nomination really began. Not to mention that basically this is a job interview, and Judge Kavenaugh clearly showed that this is not the job for him. He doesn't have the temperament. He doesn't have the way to talk to people, to be impartial about decisions that he will make if confirmed. And this is a lifelong appointment. There should have been plenty of time to review the background materials, to have a full FBI report, et cetera, so that we could know whether or not this judge is appropriate for this. Again, this is a lifetime position.
Let's go to the tape here. We want to play what we're calling here SOT 20, which has to do with the issue of due process. Let's watch this together.
but certain fundamental legal principles about due process, the presumption of innocence, and fairness do bear on my thinking, and I cannot abandon them.
She cannot abandon them. Paul J.?
Well, this is the underlying argument that all the Republicans are giving. And they're trying to have it two ways. You can't demand due process and presumption of innocence if you don't also demand what a central part of due process, which is called a police investigation. The presumption of innocence comes that the state charges you with a crime, and when you hit court, the jury is supposed to presume innocence and make the state make their case. The prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But that means there's a police investigation, not a background check. Now, what Dr. Ford accused Kavenaugh of is a crime. Now, it may be, under the laws of Maryland, in 1982, there's a year-long statute of limitations,
right.
So the Montgomery County Police, who issued a statement saying they can't pursue this because of that statute of limitation, it doesn't change the fact in what's, as they say, not a criminal case, but a job interview. Well, in a job interview, you've been alleged to have committed a crime. That's more than, you got a bad reference from somebody. Then, if you believe Dr. Ford, and everyone talks about how persuasive she was, how credible she was, but then you come and pat her on the head and say, oh, as if it's a child speaking, which is how these people often treat women. It's like a child speaking, oh, yes, she means well, but now we can ignore it. Well, if you believe it's a credible accusation, you don't have to believe there's enough for conviction. As long as you've got enough that a grand jury might say, there's enough here for an indictment, well, then you need to have a criminal investigation. This background check investigation doesn't clear up anything. You can't pursue lines of questioning. You can't subpoena people. You can't have it both ways. Yell about due process and eliminate the investigators.
So one of the things, though, that since you raised these issues, I think it's important you had to probe this from the three of us. That's what the FBI was supposed to do. The FBI was supposed to do this investigation. There's been all kinds of commentary and people writing op-eds in the Washington Post, pieces in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, many other journals, talking about the people who pleaded with the FBI to be questioned about what happened. People who were his roommates, people who lived in his dormitory, people who drank with him, people who were his friends and colleagues while he was in law school at Yale, and more. And that was completely ignored. You're talking about doing a background investigation. That wasn't even really done.
Yeah, but I think it's very important that the Democratic Party, to a large extent, played along with this game. Why did they accept a week-long extension to a background investigation that Lindsey Graham, right after they made this deal, after Senator Flake got them to make the deal, Lindsey Graham was grinning from ear to ear. And some of the commentators on Fox were saying, you know what, this may not be so bad because it's going to give them cover for voting yes. The Democrats should have said, we think there's evidence here he may have committed perjury. The FBI has to have a criminal investigation into whether this is perjury, and we're not going to go along with anything less. And if they had to, then walk out and don't lend credence to this process. They gave the Republicans and they gave the Kavanaugh forces everything they wanted to make this look like, in fact, it's due process.
Dharna, we haven't heard from you.
I guess just to piggyback on that, I think a number of people have been noting that this entire process also shows just the sort of unfair way that the legal system is tipped. I mean, many have pointed out that Senator Collins was calling for the presumption of innocence, which is something that's not really afforded to, for instance, Black people when they are tried for a number of crimes in, general everyday crimes. And Paul, you and I were watching Collins' speech together, and both sort of came away with it thinking that, this was infuriating, but really smartly done because nobody's able to sit there and fact check what she's saying. Nobody has, many of us who are watching don't have the breadth of legal knowledge that she has. But But in many cases, like, okay, she mentioned that Kavanaugh would not overturn Roe versus Wade because he believes that it's a precedent-setting case, that there's precedent, it can't be overturned. But that doesn't mean that you won't see the courts invalidate abortion restrictions. So in many of these cases, I think that even if we don't see the worst possible Brett Kavanaugh, we'll still see one who's a Brett Kavanaugh if and when he's essentially confirmed.
And one of the things we just mentioned here was what Brett Kavanaugh allegedly did when he was a teenager and in college. Those kinds of things, Dana, is what lands black and brown teenagers in jail for long stretches of time, all the time. Something we completely ignore in this process.
Every day, to what you said, every day. What was most disappointing to me about what Senator Collins said is that while she cannot possibly abandon the principles of due process in terms of why she's giving Brett Kavanaugh a pass, she can completely abandon the Senate, the long-time Senate process of thorough investigation, thorough background check, thorough review of the individual's writings, et cetera, that did not happen at all during this entire nomination process. So on one hand, again, to Paul's point, they're picking and choosing what we have to, or what we can focus on. And, to your reminder, again, people are making decisions. In this case, we should allow this individual because why? He's been on the court, because he's gone to Yale. Why? Because he's white. Why? Because he's over 50 years old. Why? Because he's male. Why? Because he's rich. We are abandoning due process, even if we're calling it something else.
And even those people who defended him would say, if he did any of these things, this happened when he was a teenager. He's a 51-year-old man now, so it shouldn't take precedence. We shouldn't be worried about this. And there's a young woman who's a legal activist in Chicago, who's actually from Baltimore, Amanda Klonsky, who wrote a beautiful op-ed about this in the Chicago Sun-Times, where she says, working with these young people in prison, they are Brett Kavanaugh, except the fact that poor black and brown kids who've been sent to jail.
Yeah, think about all of the people in this country whose lives have been ruined for one mistake that they made, far less of a mistake than what Brett Kavanaugh did. Not an act of violence, but maybe carrying weed on you, whose lives are ruined for something like that.
And could we also not forget the people who didn't have the benefit of the doubt? People like Tamir Rice, people like Trayvon Martin, people like Michael Brown, who were not given the benefit of the doubt, which is what everyone is asking that the nation give Brett Kavanaugh.
Right. Where was the presumption of innocence for Freddie Gray?
So I want to go to another tape here, and this has to do with the what we've seen from conservative forces, which was talking about mob rule, and we can talk in a moment where that quote first came from, but let's watch the tape first.
But this is the first confirmation hearing for a Supreme Court justice I've seen, basically, according to mob rule.
What we have learned is the resistance that has existed since the day after the November 2016 election is centered right here on Capitol Hill. They have encouraged mob rule. I hope we can say no to mob rule by voting to confirm Judge Kavanaugh.
And earlier today, Paul Jay and I were talking about this question of mob rule, and I'm going to return to Paul now again. This question of mob rule, and the quote from mob rule comes from somebody we know in world history. Paul?
Well, various people have talked about it, but it was Adolf Hitler that equated democracy with mob rule.
Right.
And this idea that to go and have protest, perfectly legal protest, perfectly peaceful protest, to confront your politicians in their face is mob rule. In other words, democracy is mob rule. We've seen an interesting thing on display today. You have Grassley accusing people who are opposing Kavenaugh of mob rule. So you get the kind of the hammer, the threat of the hammer, because we know what we're going to do against mob rule, and that's a stronger state and more policing, and we will put down that mob. But then you get the good cop, which is you get Collins comes, and she's able to give this what sounds like a very reasoned legal argument. Unfortunately, as reasonable as her study of Kavanaugh's case history is, it sounds like, I'm not a lawyer, and I'd be very interested to hear the critique on each of the cases that she gave, but it sounded reasonable when you listen to it. But she ends up, as I say, with this issue of presumption of innocence and the lack, when there's no proper investigation. But I want to return to that point a bit. The Democratic Party, to me, the leaders of the party and the people on the Judiciary Committee did just enough to make it look like they were fighting against Kavanaugh. But on critical moments, they did not go for the jugular. So on Thursday of last week, when Kavanaugh is testifying, and over again, he says, well, your 4 witnesses that Dr. Ford gave, they say it never happened. Now, we all know that's a crock, because 3 of them said they couldn't remember, and one of them is Judge, who is implicated, so it kind of takes out Mark Judge, whatever he might have said. It's not till the next day, when not nearly as many people are watching television, do Democrats finally bring up the point that, hang on here, you can't keep saying they didn't say it didn't happen. There's a difference between not remembering and something didn't happen. This issue of calling for investigation based on allegations of perjury, which is a criminal investigation. Bernie Sanders wrote a letter on Saturday to the White House, to the FBI, calling for such an investigation. If Sanders could see it, and a lot of other people who are commentating can see it, there were people on MSNBC and others calling this week-long extension a fig leaf. So you got to ask yourself, why did the Democratic Party people on the Judiciary Committee go along with a fig leaf? Why weren't they calling for a criminal investigation?
We can do another hour on that. I think I think that deserves a discussion, because I think it's complex, and there are lots of complex reasons why I think that probably took place. Part of it being they're an election year, and also terrified of losing the coming elections and how hard they're going to push to lose elections, and that's how people like that in that kind of leadership position often think, you know?
I also think it's something, and this is part of a much longer conversation. Every so often you get these moments, which I would call like a tear in the fabric of the mythology. Oh, the Supreme Court is this objective thing. It's above politics. It's nonpartisan. How awful it's become so partisan. I mean, the Supreme Court has always been a court that's primarily reinforces laws that have allowed the 1% to get so rich. I mean, you can't get so rich without laws, and these laws come to the court. The Citizens United law that allows unlimited funding in terms of politics, the lack of regulation of finance. I mean, all these things much of this ends up in the Supreme Court. So the Democrats are very wary of crossing a certain line where you will really tear off the veil of just how partisan, not just partisan in terms of party, how partisan in terms of class the Supreme Court is. So that they just don't want to cross that line that will throw, these institutions into disrepute. I think these institutions deserve a lot of disrepute, and we should be honest about it.
Right. But there's a lot there. I wish we had another hour here to get into this in some greater depth. Did you want to comment on that at all, Dana? Or
well, the only positive thing that I can see coming from this nomination is the people who dozed off during civics class and understanding how the election of a president affects decisions about who's on the Supreme Court, much less decades-long decisions that are made by those on the Supreme Court, that now people understand it. People are mobilized, Americans, using their First Amendment right to protest, to speak out. Everybody knows what the Supreme Court can do and the power that it has and the power of the presidency and why it's so important to vote now.
So, and go ahead, Donna.
I was actually going to make the same point that you did. I think that the new attention to the sheer undemocratic nature of the Supreme Court is really incredible. And to see, of course, this doesn't make this whole process worth it, but to see sexual assault survivors flooding senators' offices today, calling attention not only to Brett Kavanaugh's, alleged misogyny, but also just to the lack of democracy in this process, I think is, kind of incredible, and I think hopefully could spawn people to pay more attention in the future. Honestly, I think I personally have learned a lot from this process and have learned how much power the president has to make these kinds of appointments. And to your point, Paul, the partisan nature of these politicians, not only on party lines, but also on class lines. I think another thing that I've been really impressed to see is the movements calling out the sort of anti-feminist, classist nature of these conservative politics in the first place, especially the Federal Society, not only aiming to regulate women's bodies and things, but also aiming to dismantle a social safety net, aiming to dismantle a welfare state, things that would allow for women, for instance, to have access to better health care, better child care, better spread around the work that's traditionally and disproportionately done by women. So in that way, maybe this moment, I think, could be a catalyst, I guess, for a bigger set of actions.
So to kind of wrap this up a little bit here, I'm glad you raised that. I was about to raise that with you, so I'm glad you raised it right now. The larger question around women and what these issues are that come before the court that are beyond just Roe v. Wade and other issues close to that. It appears that Brett Kavanaugh will be the next Supreme Court justice to fill that vacancy, given what just happened today with Susan Collins and where the people are going to vote. Manchin came out saying he was also going to vote for him. And in his panic, running in West Virginia, that's another conversation to have. But let's talk about what the future, what this means for the future. And Dan, let me start with you, and let me just go around the room here for a minute. I mean, the Supreme Court is the institution in the United States that in many ways defines the social, political, legal mores, cultural mores of this country, especially between the 1930s and the 1980s. The progressive court decisions were made, changed the nature of America that had been struggling to end white supremacy and other issues we were facing, and workers' rights and more, and the environmental rights. Well, what is this going to mean in terms of the courts and also the future political struggle in this country, of what kind of nation we're going to have when we have the Supreme Court and most now of the federal courts, all the nominations being far to the right? I mean, this is a very dangerous thing we're face for the next 40 years, these lifetime appointments. Your thoughts?
Frightening, terrifying, horrifying. Let me pick the right adjective. In 2000, December 2000, I was protesting at the Supreme Court because of the Gore-Bush decision. I was protesting at the Supreme Court 18 years later, yesterday, because of the Kavenaugh nomination. I don't want to, in 2036, 18 years from now, be back at the Supreme Court protesting what a decision that's going to come out of this court that's going to happen, but I'm prepared to do that. And we will have to be following and watching the people who got on their sneakers, got on their T-shirts, started making their signs over the last year and a half are going to need to keep re-upping and planning and taking care of themselves and preparing for this, because this is not just a fight, as you described, at the Supreme Court, but on the state and local level where judges are, where DAs are, making decisions about people's lives every single day. And one of the glimmers of hope that I have is the level of advocacy and activism from communities across this country, across Maryland here. First and foremost, African-American women who are voting, who are active and galvanized in ways even beyond where they've been over decades in this country. Younger people who are getting involved, the March for Our Lives, the people focused on gun control, the people with Indivisibles here in Maryland, across Towson, across Montgomery County, where people are involved in local actions to make a difference, to reclaim the First Amendment for people who are poor, who are Black, who are marginalized in their communities. That's what gives me hope about what comes next, because people understand what can happen when you disengage from democracy or when you simply think that I voted November and now I'm done.
Dana? Dharna, excuse me.
The question was about hopes for the
And where this takes us. I mean, this is to me, one of the most significant moves around the Supreme Court and the future of law in this country that we've seen in a long time, in my lifetime. So I'm curious where you, especially as a person who's younger, an activist, a thinker, where do you think this takes us?
I hope that this is the end of anyone who considers themselves remotely progressive, saying that the Supreme Court is not a political court. I mean, for a number of reasons. I think, the sheer idea that it's not ideologies or that it's not this class interest, this racist, misogynistic interest that controls the Supreme Court, I think is it's been shown on its face. I hope we can see more days like today, days where people are taking to the streets and, occupying senators' offices and demanding justice and demanding action. But I also hope that, when it seems that Kavenaugh is confirmed, we can all pay attention to some of the more under the radar decisions that he has a deciding vote in. I mean, he made 300 decisions as DC Circuit Judge, and some, at least hundreds of those were anti-environment decisions. I mean, he's made a couple of truly, perplexing and horrendous decisions when it comes to the power of the EPA to act on climate change. So I hope that we can continue to pay attention. And
Paul Jay, some closing thoughts on this.
The Republicans fight for their interests as a party and for the right-wing section of the billionaire class that fund them. They fight without restraint. They no longer even care about the pretense that these institutions have these high and mighty values and so on. It's a narrow play for controlling the court, for power to advance their agenda. The problem is and let me say, that means the agenda of a massive military budget, because they are so close to the industrial military complex. A free-for-all for fossil fuel, because they are so close to fossil fuel. Free-for-all for pharmaceutical. I mean, go down the list. The Democrats, the leadership, the corporate Democrats, not all people who consider themselves Democrats, they fight with one hand behind their back, because they are financed by many of the same people who are financing the Republican Party. They have their own ties, Chuck Schumer to Wall Street. They have their own ties to the military-industrial complex and so on. So the Democrats don't go for the juggler. So what does it mean to go for the juggler now, and what should people do? In this coming election in November, and then again in 2020, vote only for candidates that are willing to impeach some of these Supreme Court justices, starting with Kavenaugh. Open up, if they do wind up with control of the House, open up a real investigation into Kavenaugh. Do it as if it's a criminal investigation. And if you find out he perjured himself in front of the Senate committee, impeach the guy. Don't treat these institutions with, as if they came from God. I mean, one of the great contributions of Donald Trump is he has allowed the presidency to fall into ridicule. And it's a good thing, because he's not the emperor, he's not a king, even though Kavenaugh might want to treat him like a king because he wants to say he's above the law. The fight is not over if people are willing to fight. Roosevelt threatened to stack the Supreme Court. If they do get control of both houses, possibly, if they win the presidency in 2020, then threaten to stack it, or do stack it. This is a war. The problem is only the other side, the billionaire class and their politicians, especially the Republicans, they're fighting it like a war. So the people need to fight it like a war.
And we hope people keep watching the Real News. We can talk about how to fight this war and what we're facing here in the United States with this new Supreme Court and what it means for all of us. I want to thank you all for joining this live special broadcast here at the Real News Network. Dana Vickers Shelley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And congratulations on being the new head of the ACLU here in Maryland.
Thanks, Mark.
Paul Jay and Dana Noor, great to have you here as well.
Thank you.
And I'm Marc Steiner here for the Real News Network. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be covering this with some intensity. Stay with us and take care.